The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the pavement outside the small, dimly lit diner where Clara stood, her silhouette framed against the fogged-up window. Her hands trembled as she clutched a worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of being carried in her pocket. Across from her, a man she barely knew, a stranger with kind eyes and a weathered jacket, sat quietly, his coffee untouched. The air between them was heavy, charged with unspoken truths. Clara's voice broke as she whispered, "I can't go back. Not now. Not after everything." The man didn't speak, but his gaze held hers, steady and unwavering, as if he understood the weight of her words. Outside, a sleek black car idled in the rain, its headlights cutting through the downpour. Inside it, Richard Langley, Clara's father, gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the diner's glowing sign. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes, not since he'd followed her here, not since he'd seen her slip out of the house with nothing but a backpack and that look in her eyes, the one that told him she was slipping away. For the first time in his life, Richard, the man who controlled boardrooms and bent the world to his will, felt powerless. His daughter, his only child, was choosing a stranger over him. And as the rain blurred his view, a single thought clawed at his chest: I might lose her. The diner's neon light flickered, casting shadows across Clara's face. She slid the photograph across the table, her fingers lingering on it as if letting go might unravel her completely. "This is all I have left of her," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. The man leaned forward, his eyes softening as he studied the image, a young woman with Clara's eyes, laughing under a summer sky. "She was my mother," Clara continued, "and no one ever told me the truth about her. Not until now." The man's hand twitched, as if he wanted to reach out, but he stayed still, letting her words fill the space between them. Richard's breath fogged the car window as he watched. He'd always thought he knew his daughter, her quiet strength, her stubborn streak, the way she'd curl up in his study with a book when the world felt too big. But this Clara, the one sitting across from a stranger, was someone he didn't recognize. She was raw, unguarded, her eyes burning with a truth he'd spent years burying. He wanted to storm into the diner, to pull her away, to demand she come home where she belonged. But something stopped him, a memory, sharp and unbidden, of the night he'd failed her mother, the night he'd chosen ambition over love. His fingers loosened on the wheel, and for a moment, he was no longer the indomitable Richard Langley, CEO of Langley Enterprises. He was just a man, staring at the daughter he might never understand. Inside, Clara's voice grew steadier, though her hands still shook. "I found her letters," she said, her eyes locked on the man's. "Hidden in the attic, tucked behind boxes he thought I'd never touch. She wrote about you. About the promises you made. About the life she wanted for me." The man's face changed then, a flicker of pain crossing his features, but he didn't interrupt. Clara leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She said you were the only one who ever saw her for who she was. Not a trophy, not a scandal, just her." The photograph lay between them like a bridge, connecting a past Clara had only just begun to unravel. The storm outside raged on, but inside the diner, time seemed to slow. Clara's words hung in the air, each one a thread pulling her closer to a truth she'd been chasing for months. The man finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "I didn't know she kept those letters. I didn't know about you." His words were careful, but they carried a weight that made Clara's chest tighten. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to demand answers, but something in his eyes stopped her, a sadness so deep it mirrored her own. She glanced at the photograph again, her mother's smile a ghost that haunted them both. Richard's phone buzzed in the car, a message from his assistant flashing across the screen, * board meeting rescheduled. Urgent, * he ignored it. For once, the empire he'd built meant nothing. His eyes stayed on Clara, on the way her hands moved as she spoke, animated and alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. He remembered the day she was born, how small she'd felt in his arms, how he promised to protect her from everything. But he hadn't protected her from himself, from the walls he'd built, the secrets he'd kept, the life he'd forced her into. The realization hit him like a blow. Asterisk, she's not running from me. She's running towards something I took away from her. Asterisk. Clara's voice rose, a mix of anger and desperation. He told me she left us. That she didn't want me. But that's not true, is it? The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked away, as if the truth was too heavy to hold. No, he said finally. It's not true. Your mother, she fought for you. Every day. But he stopped, his eyes flickering toward the window, toward the car where Richard sat. Clara followed his gaze, her breath catching as she saw the familiar outline of her father's car. Her heart pounded, a storm of emotions colliding, betrayal, longing, fear. She turned back to the man, her voice trembling. Why didn't you come for her? For me. The man's hands clenched around his coffee mug, his knuckles paled. I tried, he said, his voice breaking. God, I tried. But your father, he made sure I'd never find her. And when I heard she was gone, his words trailed off, and Clara saw the weight of years in his eyes, years of guilt, of searching, of living with a loss he couldn't name. She wanted to hate him, to blame him for the emptiness she'd carried her whole life, but she couldn't. Not when he looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Richard's hand hovered over the car door handle, his heart racing. He could end this now, walk in, take Clara home, pretend this night never happened. But the photograph in her hand, the one he'd seen through the window, stopped him cold. It was the same one he'd burned years ago, or so he thought. The one of her mother, laughing, free in a way she'd never been with him. He told himself it was for Clara's sake, that shielding her from the truth would protect her. But now, watching her with this man, he saw the cost of his lies. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was her mother's daughter, too, and that choice was leading her somewhere new. The diner's clock ticked on, each second a reminder of the distance between Clara and her father. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to know everything, she said, her voice fierce now, no longer fragile. No more secrets. No more lies. The man nodded, his expression resolute. I'll tell you, he said. All of it. But you need to be ready for what it means. Clara's eyes burned with determination. I've been ready my whole life. Outside, Richard opened the car door, the rain soaking his suit in seconds. He didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about control or power. He was thinking about Clara, about the girl he'd raised, the woman she'd become, and the truth he could no longer outrun. As he stepped into the storm, he felt the weight of every choice he'd made, every lie he'd told. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he could fix what he'd broken. 6 years earlier, the city was a different beast, its skyline softer, its nights quieter. Clara was barely 20, a girl with dreams too big for the small apartment she shared with her father's expectations. She stood at a bus stop, her coat too thin for the autumn chill, clutching a sketchbook filled with drawings she never showed anyone. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the air smelled of wet leaves and distant rain. She was waiting for a bus that never seemed to come, her mind tangled in thoughts of a future she couldn't quite see. Across the street, a man leaned against a lamppost, his jacket patched at the elbows, his eyes scanning the crowd. His name was Daniel, though Clara wouldn't learn that until later. He was a wanderer, a man who carried his past in the lines of his face and the weight of his steps. He'd come to the city looking for someone, a woman whose laughter still echoed in his dreams, a woman he'd lost to time and circumstance. But tonight, he was just a stranger, watching the world go by, until his gaze landed on Clara. She didn't notice him at first. Her attention was on the sketchbook, her fingers tracing the outline of a face she'd drawn 100 times, her mother's, pieced together from memories and photographs her father kept locked away. The wind picked up, snatching a loose page from the book, and Clara lunged after it, her boots splashing in a puddle. The page fluttered across the street, landing at Daniel's feet. He bent to pick it up, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he sensed the moment was more than it seemed. Clara hurried over, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry," she mumbled, reaching for the paper. Their fingers brushed, and for a split second, the world seemed to pause. Daniel's eyes met hers, and there was something in them, recognition, though he couldn't place it, a flicker of a memory he didn't know he had. "You're an artist," he said, not a question, his voice warm against the cold night. Clara hesitated, then nodded, tucking the page back into her sketchbook. "Just doodles," she said, though the care in her lines betrayed her. They stood there, strangers bound by a fleeting moment, the city humming around them. Daniel handed her a crumpled bus ticket from his pocket, a small gesture that felt bigger than it was. "In case you miss the next one," he said, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Clara took it, her fingers lingering on the paper, and for reasons she couldn't name, she felt safe. Not the kind of safe that came with locked doors or familiar faces, but the kind that came from being seen, truly seen, even if just for a second. The bus finally arrived, its brakes squealing as it pulled up to the curb. Clara glanced at Daniel, wanting to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She climbed aboard, the ticket still in her hand, and as the bus pulled away, she looked back. He was still there, watching her, his figure growing smaller until the city swallowed him whole. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but that moment stayed with her, a spark in a life that felt increasingly dim. Back at home, Clara's world was a different kind of storm. Richard Langley's penthouse was all glass and steel, a monument to his success, but it felt like a cage. He was at the height of his power then, a man who could make or break fortunes with a single call. But to Clara, he was just her father, demanding, distant, always watching her with eyes that seemed to measure her worth. That night, he was pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp as he negotiated a deal. When Clara slipped through the door, he barely looked up. "You're late," he said, more out of habit than concern. She didn't answer, her mind still on the stranger at the bus stop. She retreated to her room, the sketchbook open on her bed, the bus ticket tucked between its pages. She didn't know why she kept it, why it felt important, but she did. Downstairs, Richard ended his call and poured himself a drink, the clink of ice against glass the only sound in the cavernous apartment. He thought of Clara, of the way she'd looked at him lately, defiant, distant, like she was pulling away. He told himself it was a phase, that she'd come around, that his world was enough for her. But deep down, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. Across the city, Daniel sat in a cramped motel room, the kind with peeling wallpaper and a flickering TV. He was staring at a photograph of his own, a woman with Clara's eyes, though he didn't know it yet. He'd been searching for her for years, following leads that always went cold, chasing a promise he'd made under a different sky. The encounter with Clara had unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. Her face, her voice, the way she'd clutched that sketchbook, it all felt familiar, like a song he'd forgotten the words to. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling, and wondered if he'd ever find what he was looking for. Clara's life continued, a careful dance between her father's expectations and her own quiet rebellion. She worked part-time at a bookstore, sketching in the margins of her days, always carrying the weight of questions she didn't dare ask. Her mother's absence was a shadow that followed her, a mystery her father refused to unravel. "She's gone," he'd say, his voice final, and Clara learned not to push. But the sketchbook was her refuge, each drawing a piece of the mother she barely remembered, a woman her father had erased from their lives. Daniel, too, was searching, though his path was rougher, marked by dead ends and sleepless nights. He took odd jobs, moved from city to city, always chasing the ghost of the woman he'd loved. The bus stop encounter lingered in his mind, a moment that felt like a clue, though he didn't know what it meant. He kept the image of Clara's face, her hesitant smile, locked away in a corner of his heart, a reminder that the world could still surprise him. Their lives ran parallel, two threads in a tapestry they couldn't yet see. Clara, bound by her father's world, and Daniel, a drifter with nothing but a promise to keep. The bus ticket in her sketchbook, the photograph in his pocket, they were small things, insignificant to anyone else, but to them, they were anchors, tethering them to a moment that would change everything. And as the city slept, the distance between them felt both vast and impossibly small, a gap that fate was slowly closing. The city had changed in the years since that autumn night at the bus stop, its edges sharper, its pulse faster. Clara was no longer the girl clutching a sketchbook, her dreams tucked away like secrets. She was 26 now, her life a careful balance of defiance and duty. She worked at a small art gallery, her days filled with the quiet hum of creativity, but her nights were haunted by questions that refused to stay buried. The photograph of her mother, the one she'd carried for years, was now joined by a stack of letters she'd found in her father's attic, letters that spoke of love, betrayal, and a man named Daniel. Clara stood in her tiny apartment, the letters spread across her kitchen table like a map to a past she didn't understand. The handwriting was her mother's, each word a piece of a woman she'd only known through fragments. "He promised to find me," one letter read, "but your father made sure he never could." Clara's fingers traced the words, her heart racing as she read them again and again. Her father, Richard Langley, had always been a fortress, his truths locked behind walls she couldn't breach. But these letters were a crack in that fortress, and Clara was determined to pry it open. Across town, Daniel was a shadow moving through the city's underbelly. He'd spent years chasing leads, each one a dead end, each one a reminder of the woman he'd lost. The photograph he carried was worn now, its colors faded, but he couldn't let it go. He worked as a handyman, fixing things for people who barely noticed him, his life a cycle of searching and surviving. But the memory of Clara, the girl from the bus stop, lingered like a ghost. He didn't know why her face stayed with him, why her eyes felt like a key to something he'd forgotten. He only knew that seeing her had stirred something he couldn't ignore. Their paths converged again on a rainy afternoon, the kind that made the city feel small and suffocating. Clara was at the gallery, hanging a new exhibit, when the door chimed. She turned, expecting a customer, but it was Daniel. He stood there, soaked from the rain, his jacket dripping onto the polished floor. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. Clara's breath caught, the bus ticket she still kept in her sketchbook flashing in her mind. Daniel's hand tightened around the photograph in his pocket, his heart pounding with a recognition he couldn't name. "You're the artist," he said, his voice rough but warm, echoing the words he'd spoken years ago. Clara nodded, her hands trembling as she set down a frame. "And you're the man from the bus stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. Daniel glanced at the paintings on the walls, Clara's work, vivid and raw, each one a window into a grief she'd never fully named. One painting stopped him cold, a woman under a summer sky, her laughter frozen in time. It was the face from his photograph, the woman he'd loved. Clara followed his gaze, her heart lurching. "That's my mother," she said, her voice breaking. Daniel's face paled, his hand reaching for the photograph in his pocket. He pulled it out, his movement slow, deliberate, and held it up. The image was the same, her mother, younger, freer, caught in a moment Clara had only imagined. "This is her," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. "This is Elena." Clara's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of a table, the world tilting beneath her. "You knew her," she whispered. "You were the one she wrote about." The gallery felt too small, the walls closing in as Clara and Daniel stood frozen, the truth a live wire between them. Daniel's eyes were haunted, his voice raw as he spoke. "I loved her," he said. "More than anything. But your father, he took her away. He made sure I'd never find her." Clara's mind reeled, the letter's words echoing in her head. "Your father made sure he never could." She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could do was stare at the photograph in Daniel's hand, her mother's smile a bridge between them. They sat in the gallery's back room, the rain drumming against the windows, as Daniel told her everything. He spoke of Elena, of the summer they'd spent together, of promises whispered under starlit skies. He spoke of the night she vanished, of the threats Richard had made, of the years he'd spent searching for her. "I didn't know about you," he said, his voice breaking. "If I had, I would have fought harder." Clara listened, her heart a tangle of anger and longing. She wanted to hate her father, to blame him for the emptiness she'd carried, but she also wanted to understand why he'd lied, why he'd built a life on secrets. The letters were her guide, each one a piece of the puzzle. "He thinks he's protecting you," her mother had written, "but he's only protecting himself." Clara's hands shook as she read the words aloud, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Daniel listened, his eyes never leaving her face, and for the first time, Clara felt truly seen, not as Richard Langley's daughter, not as a shadow of her mother, but as herself. "She wanted you to know me," Daniel said softly. "She wanted you to know the truth." Their conversation stretched into the night, the gallery a cocoon against the world outside. Clara showed Daniel her sketchbook, the drawings she'd made of her mother, the bus ticket still tucked between the pages. He touched it gently, a smile flickering across his face. "You kept it," he said, and Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing. "It felt important," she admitted. They were strangers, yet not, bound by a past neither had fully understood until now. But the truth was a double-edged sword. Clara knew confronting her father would change everything. She thought of the way he looked at her, the way he clung to control, the way he built an empire to keep her safe, or so he thought. She thought of the letters, of the life her mother had wanted for her, a life of love and honesty, not secrets and power. And as she looked at Daniel, at the man who'd loved her mother, she felt a resolve harden inside her. She wouldn't let her father's lies define her any longer. The rain had stopped by the time they parted, the city quiet under a heavy sky. Clara stood outside the gallery, watching Daniel disappear into the night, the photograph still in her hand. She didn't know what came next, didn't know how to face her father or what the truth would cost her. But she knew she couldn't go back to the life she'd lived, to the girl who'd stayed silent. And as she slipped the photograph into her pocket, she felt her mother's presence, guiding her toward a future she was finally ready to claim. The city was softer in the early morning light, its edges blurred by a mist that clung to the streets. Clara stood at the edge of a small park, her breath visible in the cool air, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn coat. The photograph of her mother was still with her, a quiet weight against her heart, but it no longer felt like a burden. She'd spent weeks piecing together the truth, her nights filled with Daniel's stories and her mother's letters, each one a step toward understanding who she was. But understanding came with a cost, and Clara knew the final piece of her journey meant facing her father. Richard Langley was a man unaccustomed to surrender. His office at the top of Langley Enterprises was a fortress of glass and steel, a place where he'd shaped the world to his will. But these days, he was unraveling. The night he'd followed Clara to the diner had changed him, though he couldn't admit it then. He'd seen her with Daniel, seen the way she looked at him, and for the first time, he'd felt the ground shift beneath him. His daughter was no longer his to command, and the realization left him hollow. He sat at his desk now, a glass of whiskey untouched, his eyes fixed on a photograph of Clara as a child, her smile a reminder of a time when he'd been her world. Clara had moved out after that night in the diner, renting a small room above the art gallery where she worked. She needed space, not just from her father, but from the life he'd built around her. Daniel had become a steady presence, not a replacement for her mother, but a link to her, a man who carried her mother's love in his stories and his silences. They met often, sharing coffee in quiet cafes or walking the city's forgotten corners, piecing together the years they'd lost. Clara showed him her paintings, each one a tribute to her mother, and Daniel listened, his eyes bright with a pride that felt like home. But the weight of her father's silence grew heavier with each passing day. Clara knew he was watching her, waiting for her to come back, to fit into the mold he'd crafted. She'd seen his car outside the gallery once, idling in the dusk, but he never approached. Part of her wanted to hate him, to blame him for the lies that had stolen her mother's memory, but another part ached for the man who'd raised her, flawed and fierce in his love. She stood in the park now, her sketchbook under her arm, and made a decision. She couldn't move forward without facing him, without closing the circle that had begun the night she chose Daniel over him. Richard was in a board meeting when his assistant slipped him a note. "Clara is here." The words hit him like a current, and he excused himself, his heart pounding as he took the elevator to the lobby. She was there, standing by the glass doors, her coat dusted with mist, her eyes steady but unguarded. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of years hanging between them. "Clara," he said finally, his voice rough, unfamiliar without its usual command. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. "We need to talk," she said, and he nodded, leading her to a quiet corner where the city's hum felt far away. They sat across from each other, the space between them a chasm filled with unspoken truths. Clara set the photograph of her mother on the table, its edges worn from her touch. Richard's breath caught, his eyes locking onto the image. "You found it," he said, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her fingers tracing the frame. "And the letters," she said. "I know everything, Dad. About Mom, about Daniel, about what you did." Richard's face tightened, but he didn't look away. He'd spent years running from this moment, but now, with Clara's eyes on him, there was nowhere left to hide. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "Your mother, she was reckless, Clara. She loved too fiercely, trusted too easily. I thought I could give you a better life, one where you'd never know that kind of pain." Clara's eyes burned, but her voice was steady. "You didn't protect me. You erased her. You made me think she didn't want me." Richard flinched, the truth cutting deeper than he'd expected. He wanted to argue, to defend the choices he'd made, but the photograph between them was a mirror, reflecting every lie he'd told. Clara leaned forward, her voice soft but unyielding. "I needed her, Dad. Not your version of her, not the one you locked away. I needed the woman who loved Daniel, who wrote those letters, who dreamed of a life for me that wasn't about power or control." Richard's hands trembled, and for the first time, Clara saw him not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man broken by his own choices. "I was wrong," he said, the words tearing free like a confession. "I thought I could keep you safe, but I only pushed you away." The air between them shifted, the weight of his admission settling like dust. Clara didn't forgive him, not yet, but she felt the anger in her chest loosen, making room for something softer. She thought of Daniel, of the way he'd looked at her in the diner, of the stories he'd told about her mother's laughter, her courage. She thought of the park, of the mist and the quiet, of the life she was building on her own terms. And she knew she didn't need her father's approval anymore, but she wanted his understanding. "I'm not coming back," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Not to the penthouse, not to your world. But I don't want to lose you, either." Richard's eyes glistened, and he reached for her hand, hesitating before she met him halfway. Their fingers touched, a fragile bridge across the years. "I don't deserve that," he said, his voice breaking. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes steady. "Maybe not. But Mom would have wanted us to try." They sat in silence, the photograph between them a testament to the woman who'd shaped them both. Richard thought of Elena, of the love he'd buried under ambition, of the daughter he'd almost lost. Clara thought of Daniel, waiting for her at the park, of the sketchbook she'd fill with new dreams. And as the city woke around them, they took the first step towards something new, not a return to what was, but a beginning, fragile and honest. Later that day, Clara met Daniel at the park, the mist now gone, the sun breaking through. He was there, sitting on a bench, his jacket still patched at the elbows. She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing, and handed him the photograph. "I talked to my dad," she said, her voice steady. Daniel nodded, his eyes searching hers. "And?" he asked. Clara smiled, small but real. "We're not done yet. But we're starting. He took her hand, and they sat there, the city alive around them, two people bound by a woman they'd both loved, ready to face whatever came next together.